Alan Ladd generated massive global wealth for his studio as the star of Shane, but behind the rugged celluloid facade, he was an indentured laborer subjected to daily, systemic humiliation. Executives built false floors and forced him into heavily padded, restrictive corsetry, fundamentally altering his skeletal structure to meet an impossible metric of masculinity. When his physical agony culminated in a desperate suicide attempt, the studio orchestrated a ruthless cover-up, quietly abandoning the asset to a fatal chemical dependency once his margins depreciated. The American film industry during the mid-20th century did not operate as a collective of artists. It functioned as an industrial manufacturing sector. The primary commodities produced by these conglomerates were carefully engineered human images. Paramount Pictures and its competitors operated massive physical plants designed to output a consistent, standardized product. The human beings contracted to these studios were legally defined as assets. Their physical bodies were subjected to the same rigorous quality control measures as any piece of mechanical equipment. When an asset failed to meet the exact specifications of the production line, the system mandated immediate technical correction. The Western genre was the most reliable financial instrument in the studio portfolio. It required a highly specific physical architecture from its central figures. The market research of the era dictated that the American consumer demanded a towering, monolithic representation of frontier masculinity. The cinematic cowboy was not a historical reality. He was a corporate brand, designed to project an unyielding dominance over the landscape. The geometry of the cinema screen demanded strong vertical lines to contrast the wide horizontal vistas. The leading man was required to provide that structural verticality. This was a non-negotiable physical metric enforced by the executive boards. Alan Ladd entered this industrial machinery in the early 1940s. He possessed a highly marketable vocal resonance and a distinct photogenic facial symmetry. These traits registered as high-value indicators during his initial screen tests. However, the studio's medical and wardrobe departments immediately identified a severe structural deficit. Ladd measured exactly 5 feet 6 inches in height. In the rigid factory line production of the era, this dimension was not recorded as a simple biological fact. It was classified in internal documentation as a critical flaw. His physical reality directly conflicted with the commercial blueprint required for leading men. The standard operating procedure for a physical deficit of this magnitude was immediate contract termination. The studio system rarely invested capital in assets that required constant, expensive physical modification. However, the executive tier recognized a rare, highly lucrative demographic appeal in Ladd's screen presence. They made a calculated financial decision to retain the asset. This decision required a massive, ongoing logistical operation to correct his biological measurements. The studio did not accept his body. They accepted the challenge of hiding it from the consumer market. When Ladd signed his long-term studio contract, he was not simply agreeing to perform written dialogue. He was signing a legally binding agreement to undergo continuous physical alteration. The contract transferred the ownership of his visual identity entirely to the corporation. He forfeited the right to inhabit his natural biological state during any working hours. The legal mechanisms of the studio ensured that his actual dimensions, became proprietary information. Revealing his true height would be considered a breach of the carefully constructed marketing strategy. The physical modification protocols were initiated immediately by the wardrobe department. They were not tasked with designing clothing for comfort or historical accuracy. They were instructed to engineer garments that would create an optical distortion of Ladd's anatomy. The tailors constructed suit jackets with heavily padded, artificially broadened shoulders. This horizontal expansion was a deliberate optical tactic. It was designed to offset the lack of vertical height by manipulating the viewer's perception of his overall mass. Every piece of fabric was weaponized against his natural physique. The most aggressive intervention occurred at the biomechanical level. The studio contracted specialized shoemakers to construct heavy posture-altering devices engineered with hidden interior lifts. These lifts forced the heel upward, artificially extending his leg length by several inches. The mechanics of this footwear immediately compromised the natural alignment of his skeletal structure. The devices shifted his center of gravity forward, requiring constant unnatural muscular tension to remain upright. This mechanical intervention placed immediate and severe strain on his lower lumbar region. The human spine is not designed to support dynamic movement while the feet are locked in a forced elevated angle. Ladd was required to wear these devices for 12 to 14 hours a day on concrete sound stages. The physical toll was instantaneous. The stoicism that would later define his screen persona was rooted in a very real physical endurance. He was a laborer managing constant grinding joint pain while attempting to hit precise marks under heavy lighting. The psychological onboarding process was equally clinical. Studio handlers and department heads discussed his physical dimensions openly in production meetings. His height was framed not as a characteristic, but as a disease that the studio was generously treating. This established a brutal power dynamic before the first camera ever rolled. Ladd was made acutely aware that his natural state was insufficient for the job he had been hired to perform. He was stripped of his baseline physical dignity. The corporation required him to view himself through the lens of their financial investment. He was taught that his success was entirely dependent on the technical infrastructure provided by his employers. If the wardrobe department failed, or if the camera operator framed a shot incorrectly, his inadequacy would be exposed to the public. This fostered a deep institutionalized paranoia. He was isolated within a system that demanded perfection while constantly reminding him of his inherent physical failure. The studio's publicity department functioned as the external enforcement arm of this deception. They were tasked with manufacturing the public lie of his physical dominance. Press appearances were strictly controlled and tightly choreographed. Photographers were legally barred from the sets unless they were employed directly by the studio. The publicity team issued strict directives regarding the focal length and angle of any promotional images. Ladd was never photographed standing next to a taller actor without a carefully constructed visual advantage. This required a staggering level of daily logistical management. If Ladd attended a studio-sanctioned dinner, the chairs were quietly modified. If he stood at a podium, the platform was raised. The illusion of his height became a full-time corporate initiative. He lived under a constant, suffocating surveillance. Every public interaction was a calculated risk that required advanced planning by studio fixers. He was not permitted to simply exist in public spaces. He was required to perform his manufactured dimensions at all times. As the studio prepared to transition Ladd into the Western genre, the logistical challenges multiplied. The frontier narrative required vast open spaces and dynamic physical action. The tightly controlled environments of the interior sound stages could no longer contain the deception. The executives realized that standard Western sets would expose his biological reality immediately. Standard door frames, saloon bars, and hitching posts were all scaled for men 6 inches taller than their primary asset. The art directors and production designers were issued new blueprints. They were ordered to reconstruct the physical world to accommodate the lie. The infrastructure of the Western set had to be fundamentally altered to protect the financial investment in Ladd's image. This marked a significant escalation in the studio's commitment to the optical fraud. They were no longer just modifying the man, they were modifying the environment he inhabited. The construction crews built false floors on the exterior sets. They engineered intricate systems of wooden ramps that matched the color of the dirt streets. Ladd was required to memorize the exact location of these hidden elevations. He had to navigate these precarious surfaces while delivering dialogue and maintaining the rigid posture demanded by his character. A single misstep would ruin the expensive celluloid and expose the intricate mechanics of his daily humiliation. The cost of this environmental modification was substantial. It required extra lumber, extended construction schedules, and additional labor hours. The studio accountants tracked these expenses meticulously. Ladd was constantly aware that his physical deficit was costing the corporation money. This added a layer of profound guilt to his existing insecurities. He was a highly paid employee who felt like a constant financial burden to the system that created him. The mechanics of horseback riding presented another severe logistical crisis. The Western hero was inextricably linked to his mount. However, standard cinematic horses were large, imposing animals designed to dwarf average men. When Ladd approached a standard quarter horse, the scale was immediately wrong. The visual ratio between the rider and the animal shattered the illusion of dominance. The studio had to source specifically undersized horses that would visually complement his modified height. Mounting the animal required further technical intervention. He could not naturally reach the stirrups of a standard saddle from the ground. The crew was forced to dig small hidden trenches beside the horses before rolling the camera. Ladd would stand on the edge of the trench, utilizing the artificial elevation to swing into the saddle. This process was executed in front of the entire cast and crew. It was a daily mechanical reminder of his physical inadequacy, performed under the glaring lights of the California sun. Every physical interaction with his co-stars had to be mathematically calculated. The casting department was given strict parameters regarding the height of the supporting actors. However, finding competent performers who were shorter than Ladd was often impossible. The studio was frequently forced to cast taller men in antagonistic roles to heighten the drama. This required a new level of optical manipulation from the cinematography department. The camera operators utilized specific lenses to distort the depth of field. They employed forced perspective, positioning Ladd closer to the lens than his taller counterparts. When a scene required two actors to stand face to face, the crew dug literal trenches in the dirt for the taller actor to stand in. Ladd was forced to look down at men who were naturally looking over his head. The eye lines were entirely artificial. The psychological impact of delivering intense dramatic dialogue under these conditions was severe. Ladd was required to project lethal intimidation while standing on an apple box. He had to convey stoic dominance while his co-star stood in a ditch. The environment was inherently absurd, yet the corporate mandate demanded absolute, unflinching seriousness. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain the performance began to fracture his internal reality. On set, any physical limitations were treated strictly as technical obstacles that slowed down production. The primary objective prioritized the protection of intellectual property, demanding that Ladd project an impossible physiology through sheer force of will. They barked orders regarding his posture and his positioning. They demanded that he stand taller, projecting an impossible physiology through sheer force of will. The verbal corrections on set were constant and clinical. He was never allowed to forget the mechanics of his own body. Every movement was monitored by a team of technicians dedicated to maintaining the illusion. The script supervisor watched his eye lines. The wardrobe master checked the concealment of his lifts. The cinematographer measured the angle of his chin. He was a biological component in a larger machine, surrounded by engineers who were constantly adjusting his settings. The isolation he experienced on these crowded sets was profound. He was surrounded by hundreds of people, yet completely alone in his specific physical reality. The other actors did not require trenches or ramps. They moved freely through the environment, unburdened by the heavy biomechanical footwear. They inhabited their own bodies. Ladd inhabited a corporate exoskeleton, carefully constructed to satisfy the demands of the marketing department. The success of these early films only deepened his captivity. As the box office returns validated the studio's investment, the physical requirements became permanent. The public embraced the towering stoic cowboy that Paramount had manufactured. They bought tickets to see a man who did not actually exist. The overwhelming financial success of The Lie guaranteed that Ladd would never be allowed to return to the truth. He was trapped by his own profitability. The more money he generated for the conglomerate, the tighter the control over his physical image became. The executives viewed the revenue as proof that their technical interventions were necessary and correct. They had successfully commodified his face and grafted it onto a manufactured chassis. The system was working exactly as designed. The physical pain from the corrective footwear began to escalate into chronic injury. The forced spinal alignment compressed his vertebrae and strained the surrounding musculature. He required heavy massages and heat treatments just to achieve basic mobility in the mornings. The studio medical staff provided temporary relief, but they never suggested removing the cause of the trauma. The boots were mandatory. The pain was merely an operational side effect. He learned to internalize the physical suffering. The Western archetype demanded a performance of absolute invulnerability. Showing pain on set was not just unprofessional, it was a violation of the character he was paid to embody. He masked the grinding ache in his lower back behind a wall of quiet intensity. The audience read this as brooding strength. The crew read it as compliance. In reality, it was the strict discipline of a man surviving a grueling shift. The boundary between the actor and the corporate product began to blur. He spent more hours of his life inside the modified clothing and the elevated boots than he did in his natural state. The studio's relentless gaslighting took root in his own self-perception. He began to view his unedited body with the same clinical disappointment as the executive board. He internalized the industrial metric of value. When the shooting day ended, the removal of the boots did not bring relief. It brought a crushing return to reality. Stepping down from the artificial elevation was a daily, visceral reminder of the exact dimensions of the fraud. The physical drop in height mirrored the psychological drop in status. He transitioned from a towering frontier god back into a defective biological asset in the span of seconds. The system had effectively dismantled his natural confidence. They provided him with wealth, fame, and global recognition, but they extracted his fundamental physical autonomy in exchange. He was the highest paid captive in the industry. The infrastructure of humiliation was fully operational, generating massive profits while quietly grinding down the structural integrity of its central component. The physical destruction was already underway, meticulously recorded in the studio ledgers as the necessary cost of maintaining the illusion. The script dictated that the Western protagonist was a master of his environment. He was written as an entity who tamed the wilderness through sheer force of will. The man portraying this archetype lived an inverse reality. Alan Ladd was entirely subjugated by his environment. He mastered nothing on the soundstage. Every element of the physical space was designed to manage his biological deficit. He was a dependent mechanism operating within a highly controlled corporate terrarium. The illusion of his rugged independence required the constant coordinated labor of dozens of technicians. When the script called for him to stand alone against an enemy, he was never actually alone. Just outside the frame, grips adjusted the wooden boxes beneath his feet. Lighting technicians meticulously angled the key light to cast shadows that artificially elongated his jawline. The isolation on screen was a heavily populated fabrication. This was achieved through a sustained campaign of passive-aggressive communication. The feedback from directors was rarely centered on his emotional performance. It was overwhelmingly focused on his physical geometry. Instructions were stripped of artistic merit and reduced to structural demands. He was constantly told to lift his chin, square his artificially broadened shoulders, and straighten his compressed spine. The subtext of every directorial note was a reminder of his inadequacy. They were not refining a character. They were correcting a biological error. Ladd absorbed this daily barrage of micro-corrections. He processed them not as professional guidance, but as indictments of his natural form. The boundary between his professional utility and his personal worth was systematically erased by his employers. The stoic demeanor he projected on camera became his default setting off camera. The Western hero was forbidden from displaying emotional volatility or physical weakness. To show pain was to break the brand. Ladd carried this corporate mandate into his private existence. The chronic spinal agony caused by the biomechanical footwear was never discussed. He endured the physical degradation in total silence. Acknowledging the pain would require acknowledging the lifts. Acknowledging the lifts would validate the studio's assessment of his physical inferiority. Therefore, the pain did not officially exist. He compartmentalized the physical suffering, locking it away behind a mask of quiet, masculine resolve. This suppression was not an act of strength. It was a desperate survival strategy in a hostile work environment. The financial mechanics of the studio system intensified this silent endurance. The production budgets for these westerns were immense. Every minute of delay on set cost the conglomerate thousands of dollars. Ladd was acutely aware of his status as the primary revenue generator. If he halted production due to back spasms or mental exhaustion, the financial blowback would be immense. The executives would view it as a failure of their investment. He was carrying the financial stability of hundreds of crew members on his compromised spine. The guilt of potential failure was used as a motivational tool by the studio brass. They reminded him constantly of the box office projections. They framed his suffering as a necessary sacrifice for the greater economic good of the corporation. His physical comfort was deemed statistically irrelevant against the profit margins. This economic pressure fostered a profound sense of isolation. Ladd was surrounded by a massive labor force, but he was entirely alienated from them. The grips and gaffers were permitted to complain about the heat, the hours, and their physical fatigue. They belonged to a union. They were allowed to be human. Ladd was a designated corporate deity. Deities do not get to complain about their joints. He was segregated by his own fabricated status. He could not seek camaraderie with the crew because doing so would shatter the illusion of his superiority. He could not seek empathy from his co-stars, many of whom were naturally equipped with the physical dimensions he was forced to fake. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own profitability. The silence became a physical weight, pressing down on him as relentlessly as the California sun. The executives actively monitored his psychological state. They employed fixers and handlers to observe his interactions and report any signs of instability. They were not looking out for his well-being. They were conducting risk assessment on a high-yield bond. If he showed signs of fracturing, they did not offer psychiatric support. They offered tighter schedules and stricter behavioral mandates. The system was designed to break the individual and leave only the brand. Ladd's core identity was slowly hollowed out and replaced with the studio's specifications. He began to operate on autopilot, executing the required physical movements with a vacant, disconnected precision. The quiet intensity in his eyes that critics praised was often just the blank stare of a man completely disassociated from his environment. He was surviving a daily psychological attrition. The studio's gaslighting was so thorough that he no longer trusted his own perception of reality. He viewed his reflection in the mirror with the same critical, disappointed eye as the studio executives. He saw only the flaws, the deficits, and the necessary corrections. He had become an active participant in his own systemic degradation. The Western costume itself became an instrument of this degradation. The heavy leather gun belts, the woolen shirts, the wide-brimmed hats. These were not garments. They were components of the corporate uniform. Putting them on each morning was a ritual of submission. He was strapping on the physical burden of the studio's expectations. The weight of the gun belt exacerbated the lower back pain caused by the elevated boots. Every piece of the wardrobe was designed to restrict his natural movement. The padded shoulders limited his arm mobility. The lifts altered his stride, forcing him to walk with a stiff, unnatural gait. The cinematic cowboy was supposed to move with fluid, predatory grace. Ladd had to manufacture this grace while fighting against the rigid constraints of his modified clothing. It was a constant, exhausting biomechanical battle. The directors utilized this physical restriction to their advantage. They designed blocking that minimized his need to walk long distances on camera. They preferred static shots where his height could be rigidly controlled. He was often positioned leaning against a post or sitting on a fence rail. These poses were framed as classic Western stoicism. In reality, they were logistical necessities to hide his compromised mobility. The audience consumed these images as definitive proof of his masculine authority. They mistook the stiffness of his posture for unwavering moral conviction. They projected their own desires for a strong, silent protector onto his carefully engineered silhouette. The studio marketing department fueled this projection, selling millions of tickets based on a fundamental misrepresentation of human physiology. Ladd was trapped in a feedback loop of fraudulent validation. The public adored him for attributes he did not naturally possess. The studio rewarded him for successfully maintaining the deception. The only truth in his life was the physical pain and the psychological exhaustion. He was living a highly lucrative lie, and the cost of maintaining that lie was extracted directly from his nervous system. The industry's definition of masculinity was a toxic, unachievable absolute. It demanded total physical dominance, emotional impermeability, and endless endurance. No human being could meet these standards organically. The studio system created these standards through technological manipulation and then punished the actors who failed to embody them in reality. Ladd was the ultimate victim of this corporate hypocrisy. He was ordered to be a titan, but treated like a defective part. He was commanded to project supreme confidence, but subjected to daily ritualistic humiliation. This was not a paradox the studio cared to resolve. It was a functional management strategy. The friction between the myth and the reality generated the exact type of compliant, easily controlled asset the executives required. The cognitive load of managing this dual existence eventually became unsustainable. The human brain cannot indefinitely process the extreme divergence between internal reality and external projection without fracturing. Ladd was operating at maximum psychological capacity just to survive the workday. There was no reserve energy left for personal fulfillment or emotional regulation. The tank was entirely empty. As the 1950s progressed, the demands of the studio system only intensified. The Western genre evolved, requiring more complex action sequences and longer production schedules. The physical strain on Ladd's compromised spine increased exponentially. The psychological pressure to maintain the illusion grew heavier with every successful box office return. The infrastructure of his life was built on a foundation that was fundamentally unsound. He was a man standing on a hidden platform, waiting for the wood to splinter. The executives continued to add weight to the platform, ignoring the structural warnings. They did not care if the asset collapsed as long as the collapse occurred after the final frame was shot. The exhaustion was no longer just physical. It was a deep cellular depletion. The system had extracted almost everything of value. The silence that defined his screen persona became a literal inability to communicate his distress. He had no vocabulary for the trauma he was experiencing. The culture of the era provided no framework for a man to discuss emotional abuse or body dysmorphia. He was completely isolated within his own suffering, surrounded by an industry that profited directly from his silence. The anesthesia was the only remaining option. The concept of aging within this corporate structure introduced a new vector of psychological terror. The Western hero was allowed to show weathering on his face, but he was strictly forbidden from losing his physical imposing nature. As Ladd moved through his late 30s and into his 40s, the natural degradation of the human body accelerated. The metabolic changes were slight, but in an industry built on precise optical measurements, they were catastrophic. The studio's wardrobe department responded with increased aggression. If a waistline expanded slightly, the corsetry beneath the Western shirts was tightened. The rigid undergarments further restricted his lung capacity, making the delivery of long dialogue passages physically grueling. The physical corrections were no longer just about height. They were about arresting the inevitable biological clock. He was being entombed in his own costume. The hidden lifts in his boots were occasionally increased by fractions of an inch to compensate for the settling of his spine. This microscopic escalation compounded the existing neurological damage in his lower back. The sciatic pain became a constant burning current running down his legs. Yet, the production schedules remained inflexible. He was expected to perform complex physical choreography on uneven terrain while his nervous system screamed in protest. He was forced to mask the wince of pain with the signature cowboy squint. Every physical wince was quickly buried under a layer of manufactured grit. The directors praised him for his intense brooding reactions during takes. They were entirely ignorant or willfully blind to the fact that they were filming genuine, acute physical suffering. His agony was successfully monetized as dramatic tension. This tension became his primary acting tool, but it was forged in an environment of absolute fear. He was terrified of being exposed, terrified of being replaced, and terrified of the physical toll. The camera captured this cocktail of dread and translated it into compelling cinema. The audience saw a dangerous man with a haunted past. The reality was a frightened employee enduring a hostile workplace. The studio press agents utilized this on-screen intensity to further mythologize his off-screen persona. They planted stories in trade magazines detailing his quiet, stoic nature. They framed his isolation on set as the necessary process of a dedicated artist. They completely inverted the narrative. The symptoms of his systemic abuse were repackaged and sold as the defining characteristics of a true American masculine icon. This media strategy cemented his psychological prison. If he complained, he would destroy the myth that was generating his income. If he admitted the truth about the lifts, the corsets, and the hidden platforms, he would be ridiculed by the public and terminated by the studio. The corporate apparatus had perfectly engineered his silence. He was legally and financially bound to protect the system that was destroying him. He began to exhibit signs of severe cognitive fatigue. The effort required to remember his lines, navigate the physical obstacles, and manage the chronic pain was depleting his neurological reserves. He would often sit perfectly still between takes, his eyes focused on nothing, conserving the minimal energy required for the next setup. The crew learned to avoid him during these periods. They interpreted his exhaustion as dangerous volatility. The executives viewed this withdrawal as a minor inconvenience. As long as he hit his mark when the director called for action, his internal state was irrelevant. They did not employ him to be happy. They employed him to be tall, silent, and profitable. The human being underneath the wardrobe was systematically ignored. His biological deterioration was simply not factored into the production equations. The Western genre was inherently violent, requiring the protagonist to endure physical punishment on screen. Ladd was subjected to stage beatings, simulated gunshots, and grueling horseback pursuits. The choreography of this violence was precise, but the physical impact on a compromised body was real. He was thrown into dirt, slammed against breakaway furniture, and forced to endure the concussive force of blank ammunition. The stunt coordinators were given strict instructions to protect his face, but his torso and spine were considered expendable. He was frequently required to perform his own minor stunts to maintain the visual continuity. Dropping to the ground during a shootout or diving behind cover sent shockwaves through his artificially aligned skeletal structure. The physical trauma was cumulative, layering new injuries over the chronic inflammation caused by the boots. He was denied the basic recovery time afforded to normal athletes. The shooting schedule of the Golden Age was relentless. A typical Western was completed in a matter of weeks, requiring 6-day work weeks and grueling hours. There was no off-season. When one production wrapped, he was immediately shuffled into the wardrobe fittings for the next. The mechanical grinding of the studio system never paused to allow the asset to heal. The lack of physical autonomy extended to his dietary intake. The studio monitored his weight meticulously. He was subjected to forced, rapid weight loss regimens if the executives deemed his face too soft for the harsh lighting of the frontier sets. These crash diets further weakened his physical structure and depleted his energy levels. He was starved, elevated, compressed, and paraded before the cameras. He was a biological hostage. The terms of his surrender were drafted in corporate boardrooms and enforced by the daily mechanics of the soundstage. He surrendered his spine to the wardrobe department. He surrendered his perspective to the camera operators. He surrendered his dignity to the directors. The only territory he retained was the dark, isolated space inside his own mind. Even that internal space was constantly under siege by the studio's demands. The gaslighting had successfully rewritten his internal monologue. He no longer required a director to tell him he was inadequate. He supplied the criticism himself. He had internalized the metric of the 6-foot leading man. He judged his own worth against an impossible standard that was specifically designed to keep him subservient. The toxicity of this environment cannot be overstated. It was not a matter of a few difficult personalities or a demanding director. It was a systemic, institutionalized process of psychological dismantling. The entire apparatus of the studio, the lights, the cameras, the contracts, the publicity, was aligned against his biological reality. He was one man fighting a multi-million-dollar corporation for the right to exist in his own skin, and he was losing. The stoic cowboy was a cultural ghost. He did not exist in the boardrooms or on the backlots. The men who played him were laborers engaged in heavy, deceptive manufacturing. Alan Ladd was the most efficient producer of this specific ghost. He generated millions of dollars by perfectly executing the required physical and emotional suppression. He was the perfect employee for a profoundly diseased industry. The breaking point was a slow, agonizing structural failure. The weight of the deception, the chronic pain, and the absolute isolation finally exceeded the load-bearing capacity of his nervous system. Recognizing the signs of impending collapse, studio executives did not initiate repair protocols. They simply calculated how many more films they could extract. Pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance, Ladd required an escape route to detach his consciousness from the physical nightmare of the soundstage. The industry provided no sanctioned exits. A breach of contract would result in total financial ruin and public disgrace. He was trapped in the center of the machine he helped build. The only viable option was internal sabotage. He had to artificially suppress the neural pathways that were transmitting the pain and the terror. He had to shut down the system from the inside. This was the specific clinical environment that necessitated the introduction of heavy chemical intervention. It was not a failure of character. It was the predictable biological response to a decade of relentless, systemic abuse. The transition to chemical dependency was the final tragic phase of his employment. The studio had successfully broken the man. Now the man had to find a way to numb the pieces. The dawn of the 1960s introduced a lethal new variable into the corporate equation. The television industry was systematically dismantling the traditional theatrical Western market. The studio conglomerates were losing their monopoly on frontier narratives to weekly broadcasts. This macroeconomic shift directly impacted the valuation of aging physical assets like Alan Ladd. His box office margins were shrinking, making the high cost of his logistical maintenance increasingly difficult to justify to the shareholders. The executives initiated a phase of aggressive financial extraction. They recognized that the operational lifespan of the asset was nearing its definitive end. The strategy shifted from long-term brand management to short-term liquidation. They placed him in lower-budget productions with accelerated shooting schedules. The meticulous lighting and carefully engineered sets that had previously protected his visual identity were slowly withdrawn. The corporate shield was lowered to reduce overhead costs. He was exposed to harsher conditions and less forgiving camera work. This sudden withdrawal of infrastructural support triggered a profound psychological panic. For 2 decades, Ladd's entire sense of security was tied to the studio's willingness to hide his biological reality. As the production values dropped, the optical illusion began to fray. The hidden ramps were replaced by cheaper camera angles that often failed to conceal his height deficit. The wardrobe department spent less time customizing his restrictive garments. The system was visibly abandoning him. The withdrawal of these protections amplified his reliance on chemical anesthetics. The barbiturates were no longer just a buffer against the physical pain of the lifts. They became the only mechanism to manage the terror of his impending professional obsolescence. He was a manufactured product watching his own market value plummet in real time. The studio fixers stopped regulating his intake with their previous precision. They simply allowed the toxicity to escalate, viewing a potential collapse as an acceptable conclusion to a depreciating contract. By the autumn of 1962, the internal pressure reached a critical, unmanageable threshold. The artificial barrier between his corporate persona and his biological reality finally ruptured. The chemical agents failed to suppress the accumulated trauma of 20 years of systemic humiliation. His cognitive functions deteriorated into a state of severe, isolated paranoia. He was entirely disconnected from the operational reality of his life, trapped in the psychological wreckage of the Western myth. In November 1962, the crisis escalated from a slow biological degradation to an immediate physical emergency. Ladd could no longer sustain the cognitive dissonance required to inhabit the manufactured cowboy archetype. The pressure culminated in a catastrophic self-directed incident involving a firearm, the very symbol of his cinematic brand. The act was the inevitable mathematical conclusion of decades of psychological battery. The resulting trauma to his chest cavity was massive, necessitating critical medical intervention. The architectural integrity of his biological system was violently breached. The moment the gunshot echoed, the Hollywood crisis management infrastructure was activated. This was not an emergency medical response. It was a corporate asset containment operation. The primary objective was not the preservation of human life, but the protection of intellectual property. The initial phone calls from the residents did not go to municipal dispatchers. They were routed directly to the studio's executive security division. The fixers were mobilized before the paramedics were even notified. These fixers arrived at the scene with clinical efficiency. Their mandate was to secure the perimeter and establish immediate control over the forensic environment. They isolated the domestic staff and confiscated any physical evidence that contradicted the approved corporate narrative. The reality of a severe mental collapse was legally and financially unacceptable. A suicide attempt by a major Western icon would instantly devalue the studio's massive archive of his films. The narrative had to be aggressively sanitized. When municipal law enforcement finally arrived, they encountered a heavily managed crime scene. The studio's legal representatives were already present, dictating the terms of the investigation. The police reports were subjected to intense corporate review before being officially filed. The financial leverage of the conglomerates over local municipalities during this era was absolute. The investigators understood that contradicting the studio's narrative would result in severe professional retaliation. The investigation was functionally frozen. The transportation to the medical facility was executed under strict operational secrecy. Ladd was admitted under an alias, bypassing the standard emergency room protocols. The hospital administrators were briefed by studio lawyers regarding the extreme confidentiality requirements. Entire floors were locked down, and the attending medical staff were required to sign aggressive non-disclosure agreements. The corporation established a total quarantine of information around the bleeding asset. While surgeons attempted to repair the massive ballistic damage to his thoracic cavity, The publicity department drafted the official corporate statement. The wording was meticulous, designed to entirely erase the psychological reality of the event. The press release categorized the severe gunshot wound as a mundane operational error. They informed the global media syndicates that Ladd had simply tripped and misfired a weapon while conducting routine maintenance. It was a calculated, insulting fabrication. This narrative was immediately distributed to a compliant entertainment press. The journalists of the era operated within an ecosystem entirely controlled by studio access. To question the official statement was to risk permanent exile from the industry. The reporters transcribed the lie without conducting any independent verification. The front pages of the trade magazines and national newspapers broadcasted the sanitized version of the tragedy. The corporate cover-up was seamless and universally accepted. The public consumed the accidental discharge narrative without hesitation. It aligned perfectly with the rugged firearm handling persona the studio had marketed for decades. The consumers were completely insulated from the clinical horror of his mental collapse. They believed they were reading about a clumsy cowboy, not a psychologically shattered laborer executing a final desperate act of insubordination. The system successfully weaponized his own brand to hide his destruction. While Ladd recovered in the hospital, the executive boards assessed the situation with the cold calculation of actuaries. To the studio system, the math of his extensive injuries was likely definitive. His capacity to generate primary box office revenue had ended. By 1963, as his utility as a leading man dropped, conglomerates invoked standard clauses to sever remaining financial liabilities. The corporate infrastructure that had artificially propped up his existence for 2 decades was rapidly dismantled. This withdrawal of logistical support was clinical and absolute. He was stripped of the studio handlers who had previously regulated his schedule, his public appearances, and his chemical intake. The wardrobe departments repossessed the specialized garments designed to conceal his physical dimensions. The publicity teams immediately ceased all monitoring and protection of his media presence. He was unceremoniously ejected from the controlled terrarium of the backlot and left entirely to his own deteriorating devices. The transition from a heavily managed corporate deity to an isolated, unemployed citizen accelerated his biological collapse. Without the rigid framework of a production schedule, his daily routine lost all structural integrity. The chemical dependency, once carefully calibrated by studio fixers to ensure functional performance, now operated without any external boundaries. He was no longer medicating to survive a grueling 12-hour shift on a soundstage. He was utilizing heavy central nervous system depressants to entirely blot out the conscious reality of his obsolescence. His physical environment mirrored his professional exile. He retreated to his private estate in Palm Springs, a geographical isolation that matched his industrial alienation. The residence became a holding facility for a man awaiting the inevitable failure of his own internal systems. He was surrounded by the immense wealth generated by his manufactured persona, yet utterly incapable of enjoying its benefits. The capital he had accumulated served only to fund the uninterrupted supply of his chemical anesthesia. The physiological damage sustained during the 1962 ballistic incident compounded his rapid decline. The massive trauma to his thoracic cavity had left him with permanently compromised respiratory mechanics. His lung capacity was severely diminished, making even minor physical exertion an agonizing task. The neurological shockwaves from the event had further degraded his motor controls and cognitive processing speeds. He was inhabiting a structurally compromised vessel that was actively failing. The pharmaceutical regimen required to manage his chronic pain and psychological terror reached highly toxic levels. He consumed vast quantities of commercial alcohol in tandem with potent, prescription-grade sedatives. This specific interaction created a lethal pharmacological feedback loop within his bloodstream. The alcohol stripped away the stomach lining and expedited the absorption of the barbiturates. The combined effect aggressively suppressed his respiratory drive and overwhelmed his liver's filtration capacity. His isolated state ensured there was no medical oversight to correct this fatal trajectory. The industry doctors who had previously administered to his onset injuries were no longer on his payroll. He was entirely dependent on private physicians who readily supplied the necessary prescriptions without demanding clinical rehabilitation. These transactions were quiet, efficient, and devoid of any genuine intervention. The medical establishment functioned merely as a supply chain for his self-directed erasure. The psychological reality of his final months was defined by a profound, unresolvable cognitive dissonance. The television networks were continuously broadcasting the films of his prime, syndicating the lie of his towering, invulnerable masculinity to millions of homes. He could turn on a screen and watch the perfectly lit, biomechanically altered version of himself dominating the frontier. This digital ghost was generating massive residual profits for the studio conglomerates. Meanwhile, the actual biological source of that image was expiring in a dark room, barely able to draw a complete breath. He understood the absolute finality of his professional elimination. The Western genre was transitioning to a new era of grittier, highly physical anti-heroes, a market demand he could not possibly meet. The younger actors inheriting his mantle were naturally equipped with the physical dimensions he had sacrificed his spine to emulate. He was an obsolete piece of hardware in an industry that had fundamentally upgraded its manufacturing standards. There was no potential for a late-career renaissance. The market had definitively closed. As 1963 bled into 1964, his central nervous system began to exhibit the undeniable symptoms of end-stage toxicity. His periods of lucidity became increasingly rare, replaced by extended chemically induced fugue states. His internal organs, relentlessly battered by decades of synthetic suppression, began to lose their operational cohesion. The biological machinery was seizing up under the weight of the accumulated chemical sludge. The system was approaching a total catastrophic shutdown. In late January of 1964, the fatal interaction of his consumption habits finally materialized. He ingested a lethal combination of alcohol and central nervous system depressants. Alan Ladd died entirely alone at the age of 50. His demise was not a dramatic frontier shootout, but the quiet expiration of a man pushed far past his physical and psychological limits, a direct casualty of a system that had systematically overworked, chemically altered, and ultimately abandoned him. The immediate aftermath of his passing was handled with the same cold logistical efficiency that had defined his career. The local coroner's office, heavily influenced by the lingering power of the studio conglomerates, processed the remains. The toxicology reports clearly indicated a fatal interaction of alcohol and sedatives. However, the forensic documentation was carefully worded to avoid any legal implication of a deliberate, self-inflicted act. The medical examiners categorized the event as an accidental cerebral edema. This precise phrasing was a final gift to the Hollywood machine. It provided the studios with the exact legal terminology required to protect their investments. The publicity departments of his former employers immediately seized upon the coroner's report. They drafted press releases expressing profound corporate sorrow while aggressively cementing the tragic accident narrative. They required the public to view his demise as a random stroke of bad luck, completely divorced from his occupational history. The entertainment press dutifully transcribed the corporate dictates. The obituaries celebrated the stoic Western hero, detailing his box office triumphs and his manufactured frontier legacy. They entirely omitted the decades of physical humiliation, the biomechanical alterations, and the severe cognitive manipulation. The media willfully participated in the final erasure of his suffering. They buried the reality of the broken laborer beneath the towering monument of the cinematic cowboy. The studio executives did not attend his private interment. They monitored the public reaction from their boardrooms, ensuring that his passing did not negatively impact the broadcast value of his catalog. Once the news cycle moved on, his file was permanently closed and moved to the archives. He was successfully transitioned from an active liability into a purely historical asset. The corporation retained the profitable image and cleanly disposed of the biological waste. The historical record of Alan Ladd serves as a definitive, unassailable indictment of the golden age studio apparatus. His career was not a triumph of the American dream. It was a grueling, decades-long industrial accident. He functioned as the primary case study for the lethal consequences of Hollywood's toxic manufacturing standards. The conglomerates demanded a specific metric of violent, unyielding masculinity, and they were willing to destroy a human being to produce it. His legacy is the cold, legal proof that the cinematic Wild West was built on a foundation of severe occupational abuse. The stoic endurance audiences praised was the actual visible agony of a man standing on hidden wooden blocks, his spine compressing under the weight of a corporate lie. Alan Ladd was systematically hollowed out, medicated, and worked to death to sustain an illusion. The Western myth survived, perfectly preserved on celluloid, while the man who carried it was quietly eliminated by the system. When Alan Ladd died on January 29, 1964, the coroner's ruling of accidental cerebral edema provided the studios with their final masterpiece of legal sanitization. The autopsy, however, revealed the true forensic ledger of his career: severely compressed lumbar vertebrae, the permanent signature of a decade in biomechanical footwear. The media printed standard obituaries of a rugged frontier hero, willfully participating in the final erasure of his suffering. Alan Ladd's true legacy is not located in the cinematic archives. It is the cold proof that the Golden Age's metric of unyielding masculinity was a lethal corporate fabrication. The Western myth survived, perfectly preserved on celluloid, while the man forced to carry it was systematically hollowed out and quietly eliminated by the system.